Imagine taking like a really powerful substance that actually has a 1 in 3 chance of making your absolute worst psychiatric symptoms violently worse.
Right, like severe symptoms.
Exactly. We are talking about symptoms that could potentially, you know, land you in a hospital emergency room.
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought.
It really is. But now, imagine surviving that terrifying experience, walking out the other side, and rating it as one of the most genuinely helpful, transformative things you have ever done for your mental health.
It sounds completely contradictory.
Right. That paradox is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive. We're looking at a diagnostic and treatment landscape that pretty much defies all of our standard clinical expectations.
Yeah, we are really exploring the absolute frontier here where chronic mental illness intersects with psychedelics. And I got to tell you, the data we have today is going to force a total rethink of how we view risk, recovery, and, well, resilience.
For sure. So today's mission is centered on a truly groundbreaking international web-based survey. It was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology back in 2023.
Authored by Morton and colleagues, right?
Yeah, Morton and colleagues. And we are looking exclusively at people diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which, we'll just refer to as BD for short,
Yeah.
who are actively using psilocybin.
Which most people commonly know as magic mushrooms.
Exactly. Magic mushrooms.
And I think to set the parameters of what we're looking at right out of the gate, this is not a clinical trial.
Oh, not at all.
Right. There are no scientists administering carefully measured doses in like a sterile room with ambient music and medical monitors.
No safety nets.
None. This is raw, real-world data. The survey captures the experiences of 541 adults with bipolar disorder.
And their average age is what, around 34?
Yeah, around 34. And they are detailing their unprescribed, entirely self-directed experiences with psilocybin.
Which is just wild to think about. If you are listening to this and you've ever dealt with a chronic health issue, you know the exhaustion of just trying to find a baseline.
Just trying to feel normal.
Right. So you really have to put yourself in the shoes of these patients. Whether you are prepping for a meeting on mental health trends or catching up on the absolute bleeding edge of psychology, or, you are just insanely curious about how the human brain actually works under extreme pressure, we are going to give you the core insights of this data.
Yeah, we will explain the actual mechanics of what is happening in the brain, but, without drowning you in dense medical jargon.
Please, no medical jargon.
I promise. The goal here is to really examine these findings strictly from the viewpoint of the patients themselves.
Which is so rare in this kind of literature.
It is. We want to weigh their unique motivations for taking such a massive risk, the terrifying neurological vulnerabilities they face, and honestly, their surprisingly nuanced takeaways.
So before we get into the really wild, paradoxical results of this survey, we really need to understand the biological and medical reality these patients are living in.
Yeah, we need context.
Right. Like, why are people with bipolar disorder risking their stability to go underground and self-experiment with psychedelics in the first place?
Well, living with bipolar disorder is an incredibly grueling neurological reality.
I can only imagine.
When most people hear bipolar, they immediately picture mania. The extreme highs, the dangerous impulsivity, rapid speech, delusions of grandeur.
That's definitely the pop culture stereotype.
Exactly. And while mania is the defining diagnostic feature, it's what separates it from clinical depression, patients actually spend far more of their time in debilitating, crushing, depressive states.
Well, the highs are just a small part of it.
Right. It is a pendulum that spends most of its time in the dark.
And the survey points out that the patients themselves consistently rate that heavy depression as the most burdensome, agonizing part of the illness.
And here is the real kicker. Our current clinical toolbox for treating that specific bipolar depression is deeply, deeply flawed.
What do we normally use?
The traditional approach involves mood stabilizers like lithium or heavy antipsychotics. And look, those can be very effective at keeping the patient alive and preventing severe mania.
Which is obviously important.
Very important, but they often come with massive life-altering side effects.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this with a visual for everyone listening. Treating bipolar disorder is sort of like trying to fix a highly sensitive, overpowered car engine that just keeps redlining.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so mood stabilizers, like lithium, they act like a heavy physical governor on that engine. They absolutely stop the dangerous manic high speeds that could, crash the car.
Right, they prevent the disaster.
Exactly. But they restrict the engine so much that the patient struggles to even get the car up a hill. So they are safe, but they're stuck in this heavy, sluggish depression.
That is a perfect way to look at it. So the natural follow-up question is, well, why not just give them a traditional antidepressant to get them up the hill?
Right, just giving them an SSRI or something.
You'd think so. But the problem is the underlying neurochemical volatility of bipolar disorder. When you introduce a standard SSRI antidepressant, you are flooding the brain with serotonin to lift the mood.
Which works for normal depression.
Usually, yes.
Oh.
But in a bipolar brain, that sudden flood acts like injecting nitrous oxide into that sensitive engine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it doesn't just get them out of the valley, it actually risks blowing the engine entirely, pushing the brain into a severe manic episode.
Because the brain is already primed for those extreme pendulum swings.
Exactly. Which leads to a massive scientific blind spot regarding psychedelics.
This is where it gets frustrating.
It really is. Psilocybin also acts profoundly on serotonin receptors, specifically the 5-HT2A receptor.
Right.
And because the medical community knows that tinkering with serotonin can trigger catastrophic mania, clinical trials for psilocybin currently categorically exclude anyone with bipolar disorder.
Anyone.
Anyone. They even exclude people who merely have a family history of it.
That is so crazy. So if you are reading mainstream media articles touting psychedelics as this, like miraculous FDA fast-track cure for depression and PTSD, you might assume bipolar patients are part of that revolution.
But they're not.
There is zero clinical trial data for them.
Zero. The scientific doors are completely locked shut. The medical establishment has basically determined the pharmacological risk is simply too high.
But the patients are still suffering from that crushing depression.
Right, so they aren't just waiting around for the science to catch up. They are going underground to figure it out themselves.
Which brings us to the actual survey data on why these patients are taking psilocybin. And I have to say, this really threw me.
The motivations are surprising, aren't they?
Super surprising. If you are locked out of the clinic and your daily reality is this miserable mix of severe depression and the looming threat of mania, you are desperate.
Absolutely.
You would think the #1 reason to take mushrooms would just be, I want my depression to stop.
Just cure the symptom.
Right. And yes, treating a mental health condition was a major goal for 53% of the users. But the #1 motivation, coming in at 60.4%, was actually personal development.
Over 60%.
Yeah. They specifically cited existential exploration, personal growth, and self-awareness.
It is a striking statistic, and it really demands closer analysis. Over 60% are prioritizing abstract personal development over concrete symptom management.
I have to push back on this a little bit on behalf of anyone listening who might be skeptical.
Go for it.
Aren't people with severe chronic mental health conditions usually just desperate for a baseline of symptom relief? I mean, if your car engine is constantly breaking down and ruining your life, you don't usually sit in the driver's seat to ponder the existential beauty of the highway.
You just want the engine fixed.
Exactly. You just want the engine fixed.
Why is there such a massive focus on existential exploration and spiritual growth rather than just curing the disease?
To answer that, we really have to synthesize the qualitative responses, like the actual written comments from the patients in the survey.
Okay, what did they say?
When you live with a chronic, volatile condition like bipolar disorder for years, you eventually realize that a simple, clean chemical fix might never exist for you.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
Very tough. Living with this disorder requires confronting incredibly complex, painful realities about your own mind. You literally cannot trust your own moods.
Wow.
Think about it. You wake up and you don't know if your sudden burst of energy is genuine happiness or the terrifying start of a manic episode that will ruin your life. That level of constant self-surveillance sounds psychologically exhausting.
It is. It creates a profound layer of trauma simply from living with the diagnosis. These patients aren't just looking for a pill to numb the pain anymore.
They want something deeper.
They want to radically change their psychological relationship with their own broken engine. They use psilocybin because they are seeking a new perspective on their suffering.
Ah, so it's a coping mechanism, but like a really advanced one.
Exactly. They are trying to build a stronger psychological framework to cope with a condition they know they will carry for the rest of their lives.
The quotes from the participants really bring this abstract idea down to earth. Like when asked why they chose psilocybin for growth, one participant wrote, "The experience brought up past traumatic memories that I was able to process in a healthy way."
Right, because bipolar disorder doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
These patients carry deep psychological scars, often resulting from the fallout of their own severe mood episodes. relationships ruined during mania, years lost to depression.
So much collateral damage.
Yeah. And psilocybin, in their view, provided the cognitive flexibility to process that baggage.
Another quote that stood out to me was about breaking out of rigid thought patterns. Someone said, "I no longer see things black and white. In reality, we live in a complex world."
That cognitive shift is huge.
And then there's the spiritual connection. One person wrote, "I was finally able to see the true beauty in nature. My attitude thereafter has significantly changed towards my existence."
When you listen to the way they describe these experiences, you realize they are achieving profound psychological milestones.
You really are.
They are developing introspection, emotional elasticity, and deep self-compassion.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. Because seeking profound personal growth, processing trauma, and feeling connected to nature, that all sounds beautiful.
It does.
But we absolutely cannot ignore the biology here. Bipolar disorder involves severe neurochemical volatility. And psilocybin is a powerful, reality-altering substance that binds to the very serotonin receptors that control mood and perception.
The 5-HT2A receptors, exactly.
So what actually happens neurologically when these patients ingest it?
Well, we have to address the elephant in the room, the adverse effects. Because it isn't all spiritual awakenings and peaceful nature walks.
Not at all. The survey data on the dark side of this self-experimentation is actually quite alarming.
Give us the numbers.
Nearly a third of respondents, 32.2%, reported new or increasing psychiatric symptoms after their psychedelic trip.
That is a significant chunk.
It is. We are talking about the exact things bipolar patients spend their lives trying to avoid. The most prominent issue was new manic symptoms, hitting 14.2% of users.
Wow.
Then you had severe difficulty sleeping at 10.4%. and heightened lingering anxiety at 9.4%.
Honestly, those numbers represent the exact nightmare scenario that keeps clinical trial directors awake at night.
Taking psilocybin with bipolar disorder sounds like putting a megaphone to your brain.
A megaphone.
Yeah, like it amplifies the profound spiritual connections and the emotional processing, but it also amplifies the underlying neurological instability. You are turning the volume up to 11 on everything, including the disease itself.
That's a great analogy. And this raises an important question regarding the specific mechanics of that danger.
What do you mean?
Well, to the average person listening, a bad night of sleep or some extra anxiety after a mushroom trip might just seem like a bad hangover. You drink some water, you rest, you get over it.
Right, you sleep it off.
But for someone with bipolar disorder, sleep disturbances are notoriously dangerous.
Because it's not just feeling tired the next day at work.
Far from it. In bipolar biology, disrupted sleep is a known prodrome.
A prodrome.
Yeah, a prodrome is an early warning sign and a primary biological trigger for severe manic episodes. The circadian rhythm in a bipolar brain is incredibly fragile.
So one bad night of sleep can ruin everything.
Basically, yes. If a psilocybin trip keeps a bipolar patient awake for 24 hours, their dopamine receptors can become hypersensitive. And that sleep loss feeds a sudden surge of manic energy, which then prevents the brain from sleeping the next night, creating a rapid, violent downward spiral into psychosis.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
But the survey found something genuinely surprising about who was actually at risk for this downward spiral.
Right, the breakdown between the diagnoses.
Yeah. So in traditional psychiatry, bipolar disorder is generally split into two main diagnostic categories. Bipolar 1 is characterized by a history of full-blown, severe mania, often including delusions or hospitalization.
That's the extreme high we talked about.
Right. Bipolar 2, on the other hand, involves deep, prolonged depressions, but traditionally only hypomania, which is a milder, less destructive form of elevated mood that doesn't reach the level of psychosis.
So they don't get as high on the pendulum.
Exactly.
Right.
So logically, you would assume that bipolar I patients would have a much higher rate of adverse manic reactions to psilocybin because their brains have already paved the neurological highways for full mania.
I assume the bipolar 2 patients would be relatively safe, just dealing with the depression side of things.
That's what I thought too. But the survey found absolutely no difference in adverse event rates between bipolar I and bipolar 2.
None.
None at all. They were equally at risk. The psilocybin essentially leveled the playing field, proving that this powerful serotonin agonist can trigger severe manic symptoms, even in patients whose brains haven't historically experienced full-blown mania.
That is wild.
And we shouldn't gloss over the most severe statistic in this section. 3.3% of the users in this survey had to utilize emergency medical services.
Wow. Meaning they had to go to the ER or check into a psychiatric hospital following their unprescribed trip.
Okay.
So for about 1 in 30 people, the megaphone to the brain was so loud and the neurochemical fire was so intense, it required emergency medical intervention to put it out.
The biological risks are profound.
They really are.
So, what does this all mean? We have a third of patients experiencing symptom exacerbation, some ending up in the emergency room, sleep being dangerously disrupted to the point of triggering mania.
It sounds like a disaster.
Right. Logically, looking at that data, you would assume the patient consensus is that psilocybin is a dangerous mistake for them.
You'd think the forums would be full of warnings saying, stay away, it's a failed experiment.
Exactly. But the survey reveals a fascinating paradox.
It completely upends our standard clinical way of evaluating whether a medical intervention is actually working.
Okay, get this. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being extremely harmful, the average perceived harmfulness across all these patients was only a 1.6.
Barely registering.
Barely. Meanwhile, the average perceived helpfulness was a massive 4 out of 5.
A 4 out of 5 despite everything we just talked about.
Yes. And here's the kicker for you listening. Even the specific individuals who experienced severe side effects, like the ones whose manic symptoms got worse, they still rated the drug as more helpful than harmful on average.
What's fascinating here is how the patients themselves rationalize this paradox. I mean, to understand how a drug can send someone to the hospital and still be rated a 4 out of 5 for helpfulness, we have to look deeply at the psychological concept of the mixed trip.
Right, because usually, culturally, we think of a psychedelic trip as binary.
It's either good or bad.
Yeah, it was a good trip where you saw the beauty of the universe and felt connected to God, or it was a bad trip where you were trapped in a terrifying paranoid nightmare.
But the reality reported by these bipolar patients is that the trips were highly complex and layered.
They weren't just one thing.
Exactly. A single trip could contain intense, suffocating anxiety, terrifying physical side effects, and deeply distressing hallucinations, but also profound psychological breakthroughs.
All at the same time.
All at the same time. And from the patient's viewpoint, the terror and the breakthrough were inextricably linked.
So they are actually finding value in the struggle itself.
Precisely. We really need to look at this through the lens of exposure therapy.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, in traditional exposure therapy for a phobia, you slowly expose a patient to the thing they fear, say, a spider in a controlled environment so they can practice regulating their nervous system.
Right.
For a bipolar patient, their greatest fear is often their own mind. The terrifying aspects of a psychedelic trip acted like a high-intensity fire drill.
A fire drill for their brain.
Yes. The pain wasn't just a negative side effect, it was the actual classroom where they learned how to handle their disorder.
There is a quote from the survey that perfectly encapsulates this reframing. One patient wrote, "These breakdowns are ultimately insightful despite being painful."
Insightful despite being painful. That is a radical departure from the traditional medical model, which views psychological pain strictly as a symptom to be eradicated.
Right, doctors just want the pain to stop.
Exactly.
There was another example detailing this exposure therapy concept that just blew my mind. A patient described learning how to cope with the daily grueling realities of their bipolar disorder because they survived a terrifying psychedelic trip.
What did they say?
They said, "I can now treat my endogenous hallucinations like a trip and just relax and remember it's temporary."
Okay, let's pause and define that term for a second. Endogenous hallucinations.
Yeah, break that down.
That means the hallucinations or psychosis caused naturally from inside the brain by their severe bipolar disorder, not by a drug.
So they're normal, everyday hallucinations.
Right. And this flips the entire psychiatric paradigm on its head. In standard psychiatry, the absolute goal is to eliminate the hallucination entirely using heavy medication like antipsychotics.
Just shut it down.
Exactly. But here, the patient is willingly trading an acute, terrifying period of discomfort during a psilocybin trip to gain long-term psychological resilience.
They faced the drug-induced hallucinations, survived it, and basically realized, hey, I didn't die. It passed.
Yeah. So now, when their bipolar engine malfunctions months later and produces a natural hallucination, they don't panic.
They use the drug experience to teach themselves how to self-soothe when their own brain turns against them.
They are actively building self-compassion. They are taking away the terror of their own neurochemistry because they practice surviving the psychedelic storm.
It is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
So to synthesize this entire journey for you listening, Psilocybin is clearly not a magic, risk-free bullet for bipolar disorder.
Definitely not.
The survey decisively proves the biology. It can trigger mania, it can spike severe anxiety, and it can cause dangerous sleep loss that spirals into real psychiatric emergencies.
Yeah.
We cannot ignore the 1 in 30 who end up in the ER.
Right. The data is unambiguous on the danger. The serotonin system in a bipolar brain is highly volatile, and adding psychedelics is, well, it's playing with fire.
Yet, from the viewpoint of the patients themselves, the profound personal growth, the dismantling of those rigid black and white perspectives, and the newfound ability to process trauma make those risks worth navigating.
The bad trip becomes the most important teacher they've ever had.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these findings are a massive, urgent call to action for the scientific and medical community.
What should they be doing?
What this survey shows is that bipolar patients shouldn't just be ignored and categorically excluded from psychedelic research out of clinical fear.
Because the reality is, they are already out there doing it themselves.
Right, in unmonitored, potentially dangerous settings without safety nets.
Shutting the clinical door isn't stopping them, it's just forcing them into the dark.
Exactly. Clinical trials need to be specifically adapted for their unique biology. We need to design studies that bring them in from the cold.
What would that even look like?
That means incorporating highly trained trip sitters who understand bipolar psychosis. It means strict post-trip sleep monitoring.
Because of that prodrome trigger.
Right. Perhaps using pharmaceutical sleep aids immediately after the trip to prevent that manic spiral. And it requires intensive integration therapy to help them process those terrifying but insightful breakdowns safely.
We needed to build a safer container for the fire drill.
Beautifully put.
And that brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Something to mull over on your own as you process all this data.
We started by talking about the rigid expectations of modern medicine. How we want a clean fix, a physical governor to stop the engine from revving, a simple erasure of the symptoms.
But consider this deeply counterintuitive idea. If a treatment causes a terrifying, painful psychological experience, but ultimately leaves a patient with profound self-compassion and the newfound ability to independently soothe their own terrifying hallucinations.
Should the medical community continue to classify that acute pain merely as a negative side effect to be avoided at all costs?
Or do we need to start viewing it as a necessary, unconventional medicine that we just don't have the courage to fully understand yet?
It really forces us to ask what genuine healing actually looks like versus mere symptom management.
Maybe healing isn't just fixing the broken part so it never makes a sound again. Maybe sometimes healing is learning how to sit in the driver's seat of a volatile mind, feeling the engine shake, and knowing you finally have the skills to steer through the storm.